Thank you. It's wonderful to see such a terrific crowd for what will be an intellectually stimulating and informative event. I am the provost, John McGreevy, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening's conversation. 1 year after October 7th, historical background and future prospects. We do this as a university, which has a responsibility to foster a learning environment that facilitates respectful discussion and constructive engagement on challenging issues. To be, as our new 18th University President Robert A. Dowd, CSC, said in his inaugural address, a place where openness to questions does not mean we are afraid to stand for something, where we think about and reflect together on the values that truly endure. One of the ways we do that is through the Notre Dame Forum. Established in 2000, the Forum is an annual series that invites campus-wide reflection and dialogue about issues of importance to the university, the nation, and the larger world. The university president selects the theme each year. For his inaugural Notre Dame Forum, Father Dowd has chosen a particularly timely theme. What do we owe each other? With a growing and often welcome emphasis on individual rights and freedoms, how do we nonetheless, individually and collectively, think about our responsibilities to one another? How can Catholic social thought help us engage in fruitful dialogue with those whose perspectives are different from our own, bridge social divides, and promote healing in the midst of suffering, division, and injustice? We kicked off the forum earlier this month with a series of inaugural fireside chats with global leaders in technology, philanthropy, corporate sustainability, and foreign affairs. Tonight, we gather for the first in a series of conversations on Israel-Palestine, organized by two distinguished members of our own faculty, Professor Zvi Novak and Mahan Mirza. Professor Novak, the Abrams Jewish Thought and Culture Professor of Theology, teaches broadly on Judaism. For 2 of the past 3 summers, he has led an undergraduate theology course, Christianity and Judaism, at Notre Dame site in East Jerusalem, where he has brought students into conversation with Israelis and Palestinians, with Jews, Christians, and Muslims about theological questions arising from the modern state of Israel and from the challenges confronted by Palestinians. Professor Mirza is an Islamic studies scholar and is the executive director of the Rafat and Zareen Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion at our own Keough School of Global Affairs. In that capacity, he has helped our campus understand the complex role that religion plays in conflict and the prospect of conflict resolution. Now, let me call upon and thank Professor Novak and Professor Mirza and ask Professor Nozick to introduce this evening's event. Professor Nozick.
All right. Thank you, John. The conflict in the Middle East, at the center of which is the fraught relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, has long drawn the attention of and inspired intense emotion on American campuses, and never more so than over the past year, since October 7th, 2023. The region and its challenges matter to all of us who are interested in peace, in justice, in geopolitics, and making sense of the world. It matters to us, too, as a Catholic university, one that is distinguished from almost every university in America by the fact that it has a physical campus in Jerusalem, and which is a sign of our special interest in the Holy Land. As we think in the charge put to us by the Notre Dame Forum about what we owe each other as a campus community, it's clear that one thing we owe each other is engagement with Israel-Palestine. The Israel-Palestine series that Professor Mirza and I are coordinating seeks to enable such engagement through the event this evening and others to take place throughout this academic year. Alongside these events, the two of us are also leading a 1-credit undergraduate course on the topic, and I'm pleased to welcome many of the students enrolled in that course to this event. Our gathering this evening is not a commemoration. Its aim is to think through October 7th and its aftermath as events in a specific context with ascertainable causes and consequences. The context is complex. The circumstances are terrible and tragic. We seek to acknowledge the terror and the tragedy and to appreciate the complexity. To help us do so, we've called upon the help of 3 very able individuals. The first is our moderator, whom I'll introduce now, and she in turn will introduce our other 2 speakers. Maura Policelli is the executive director of the Washington office of Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. Professor Policelli came to Notre Dame from a long and distinguished career in public policy and national politics, most immediately from a position as Chief of Staff at Oxfam America. Among her senior positions in government, she served as Chief of Staff for Congresswoman Jane Harman, the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee in the period following the terrorist attacks of 9/11, Chief of Staff to Congresswoman Gabby Giffords during her first term in Congress, and Senior Advisor to the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Education during the Obama administration. As a professor of the practice at Notre Dame, she teaches an undergraduate course on fragile states and a DC immersion course at the master's level. It's my pleasure and honor to call Professor Policelli to the podium.
Thank you. It is my distinct honor to introduce this evening's esteemed speakers, who have collaborated for several years, sharing their expertise with audiences across the United States, especially on college campuses. Over the past 11 months, they have tirelessly responded to invitations and risen to meet this critical moment. We are privileged to welcome them here to Notre Dame. Hussein Ibish is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and a weekly columnist for The National in the UAE. A former columnist for Bloomberg, Ibish contributes regularly to The Atlantic and The Daily Beast. He has made numerous media appearances and was the Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Daily Star. Ibish is the editor and principal author of 3 major studies of hate crimes and discrimination against Arab Americans, and several books on Arab Americans and civil liberties. His most recent book is entitled What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda? Ibish has a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and has held leadership roles with the American Task Force on Palestine and the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. David Myers is Distinguished Professor and Sadie Khan Chair in Jewish History at UCLA, where he directs the Luskin Center for History and Policy, as well as the UCLA Initiative to Study Hate. Myers' most recent book, American Shtetl, won the 2022 National Jewish Book Award. He is also the author of European Jewish Intellectuals and the Zionist Return to History, and Between Jew and Arab, The Lost Voice of Simon Rawinowitz. Myers has served as a visitor at a number of institutions in the U.S. and abroad, including the Institute for Advanced Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He is the longtime co-editor of the flagship Jewish Studies journal, Jewish Quarterly Review, and an elected fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research.
This is a great moment for both of us to be here for the first time. Thank you, Provost McGreevy. Thank you, Professor Novick. Thank you, Professor Policelli, for the invitation, for enabling us to speak to this illustrious audience. I'm going to jump right in because we have a lot to cover. Yep. There's a fair bit of spontaneity baked into our presentation, so you never know when there'll be a commentary upon the commentary. Yeah. I want to begin with a couple of guiding principles that I think animate my and, to a great extent, Hussein's approach. We believe that when it comes to understanding this conflict, and really when it comes to understanding anything in the world, one must hold up the dignity of all human life. One cannot choose sides when it comes to human life. That's going to be a core and guiding proposition of ours, together with a second guiding principle that we try to hold on to in our presentations, and I think is necessary in our conversations on college campuses more generally. And that is the principle of epistemological modesty, a degree of humility about knowing what we don't know, about knowing that what we present is going to be a partial account of this fraught relationship between Jews and Arabs, Palestinians and Israelis. That realization of the limits of our own capacity to understand should be a source of inspiration for our curiosity and for our commitment to seek out those who possess knowledge or who may possess opinions or perspectives other than our own. And I want to put in a major pitch for that principle of speaking across difference, even at this very difficult time. The third principle is related to the dignity of all human life. We're going to share competing narratives of the history of the relationship between Jews and Arabs, Israelis, and Palestinians. It's important to note that there's not a single narrative that represents the Palestinian view. There's not a single narrative that presents the Zionist view. There are narratives within narratives. There are counter-narratives against the hegemonic powers in each of those cases. But what we do believe is that alongside the competing narratives, there are actually competing truths and competing rights. Sometimes it seems as if those competing rights are irreconcilable, at least at the present moment. And that's a very confounding and vexing proposition. And it's one that we grapple with all the time. And we're going to try and explain why that is in this case.
Yeah.
And then we'll think together about whether there's any possibility to move beyond that.
Okay, all well said. I would add two additional things. One is, there are competing narratives, there are competing truths, there are competing rights, but there are not competing facts. There is a body of common knowledge that is very sensitive regarding this conflict that honest historians and honest observers do not actually disagree about. Question of who did and said what when is not really in dispute. We've been doing this 10 years, and there are like 2 or 3 times where we really don't agree on a fact. It's very unusual because we're honest and well-informed people who don't hesitate to look at reality as it is. Now, why those people did what they were doing, what they were intending, what was their project, and the motivation, that is heavily contested. Right? And that's where the arguments come in, the competing narratives come in, and even to some extent the competing rights. But I want to insist there are not competing facts. There are things that are factual and things that are counterfactual, non-factual, partial truths, BS, spin, and we don't want anything to do with any of that. This is not a debate between a Jew and an Arab. The point is, we are in a conversation about how these narratives develop and sustain themselves and operate within the political register in order to interrogate our own positions as much as the positions that the other side has taken. What we're doing here is a journey of mutual discovery that is not about trying to win an argument, but rather to get at something deeper that is very real. Let's begin.
There are many points at which we could start this conversation. There are many moments in history that we are going to have to pass over when we do a full 4-part rendering of this historical story. We usually begin in the late 19th century, but for reasons of time, we're going to begin in 1948, which is in many respects the most crucial year in the history of the relationship, the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Each word that we choose is itself so loaded with meaning, and we are mindful of that. But for the purposes of this conversation, we'll oftentimes use shorthand that is largely agreed upon. So why 1948? 1948 actually the story begins in the end of 1947, when the United Nations General Assembly, acting upon a report by the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, which sprung into action after the British announced they were surrendering the mandate over Palestine given to them by the League of Nations, the United Nations General Assembly issued a resolution, 181, that called for the partition of Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. That prompted an intensification of violence between Jewish and Arab forces at the local level that continued for a half a year. We're glossing over a lot of very important details, but feel free to ask in the Q&A, until May 14th, 1948, when, on the eve of the expiration of the British mandate, the leaders of the Zionist movement in Palestine declared the establishment of the State of Israel. This was greeted by many Jews in Palestine and around the world with jubilation and seen as the restoration of a long-deferred sovereignty that had been ceded in the year 70 of the Common Era with the destruction of the Second Holy Temple in Jerusalem. It is important to add that what animated the effort to create a homeland and state for the Jewish people was the recent experience of Jews in Europe. 3 years prior to this point, the Second World War ended, and the full scale of destruction wrought upon European Jewry became known. Somewhere between 5.2 and 6 million Jews were murdered by Nazi Germany and its collaborators.
Mm-hmm.
There was an added sense of motivation on the part of the nascent state and its fledgling army, about 1/3 of whose soldiers were Holocaust survivors, to gain what was called, in the spirit of this day, liberation. So the war was known as the War of Liberation, a moment of jubilation, exultation, and a sense of historical return. It's important to make that point because that event was causally linked to the other momentous event of 1948 in the region, which is the dispossession, displacement, and expulsion of Palestinians by Jewish and Israeli forces in the course of that war, which came to be known as the catastrophe, or in Arabic, the Nakba. So in the same year, and as a result of the same series of events, you have liberation on one hand and the Nakba on the other hand. One point that I want to make before handing off to Hussein to continue is we spoke of competing narratives and competing truths and competing rights. What we also see in this period is the clash of competing collective traumas. This is extremely important in understanding our apprehension of October 7th. By that, the consciousness of Jews who were survivors from the Holocaust and those who became, in some sense, hereditary victims of the Holocaust, very much informed the battle against the Palestinian population, which itself induced a searing trauma in the Palestinian national body. So let's keep that in mind, because we're going to see how that clash of traumas plays such an important and operative force today.
That's a crucial point. That's the central point. The Nakba is not just the displacement of 80% of the Arab population of the area that became the new state of Israel, which it was. It was the elimination of a whole society. In the fall of 1947, there was a very comprehensive and integrated Palestinian Arab nascent country. By mid to late 1940s, it was gone. And so the trauma is not just the displacement of the people who were displaced, but also people who were not displaced, like the 20% of Arabs in that territory who were not displaced, like many of the people in the Galilee who stayed. They weren't expelled, they didn't flee, and they were there. But they lost their society just as much, because they ended up living under martial law in this new Jewish Israeli state, cut off from their relatives, and the society they had is also gone. The bookend of this period, which starts the Arab-Israeli War as we remember it, 1948, it gives way to a series of confrontations between Israel and a number of frontline Arab states. The Palestinians exited history for about 20 years. They were concentrating on their own families, on their own survival. Their national institutions were gone, destroyed between the uprising against the British in the 30s and then the experience of the Nakba in 48. For 20 years, the Arab-Israeli War was a war between Israel and Arab states. In 1967, that reached a culmination with a war that Arabs mostly expected to win, at least over a long struggle. They were taken aback by the breadth and speed of the Israeli victory. It left Israel in possession of all of the rest of mandatory Palestine, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, plus the Sinai Peninsula, plus the Golan Heights from Syria, in possession of a large amount of territory. Eventually, the Arab-Israeli phase of the conflict gets resolved by the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt in 1970, after which Arab states are no longer in a position to pursue state-to-state war with Israel. The PLO takes over the Palestinian national movement, takes Palestinian decision-making away from Arab countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, others who've tried to manipulate it. Palestinians become independent decision makers on their own through the PLO. Through a complicated process, the PLO ends up back in the occupied territories by the end of the First Intifada. That then gives way as the Cold War ends. This emerges as a kind of monopolar world to a Palestinian-Israeli agreement and the creation of limited Palestinian self-ruled areas in the occupied territories. The West Bank is divided into the smallest section, Area A, which is just some of the Palestinian population centers, which are self-ruled administered areas. Area B, which is another 30%, which is supposedly Palestinian civil control and Israeli military control. The bulk, 60%, where all the settlements are, is strictly under Israel's control. Gaza was part of Area A. Instead of the Oslo process yielding over a 5-year period to the creation of a Palestinian state, this creation of Area A, B, and C is still with us. It was supposed to end in 1998, and it's not going anywhere. Similarly, the Palestinian Authority was supposed to expire after 5 years, is still ruling in the self-administered areas of the West Bank. In 2005, Israel withdrew its settlers and military from the interior of Gaza, preferring to control it from the outside, controlling all ingress and egress and the electromagnetic spectrum and the coastline, but not the interior. And Hamas comes to rule in Gaza. Violent takeover from Fatah following divided elections, presidential election won by Fatah overwhelmingly, and a parliamentary election won by Hamas-backed candidates with a very strong 44% showing, which is good in a parliament. And the cohabitation didn't work. There was a violent split when initiated by Hamas expulsion of Fatah from the West Bank, from Gaza, but then same thing done on the other side, and the beginning of the division of the Palestinian national movement that we see to this day, and that has been nurtured like a hothouse orchid by the Israeli right, particularly by Prime Minister Netanyahu. In all of that, the Palestinian issue seems to recede in importance. The Oslo era culminated with the Camp David summit, in which no progress was made, and it was obvious that the Palestinians and the Israelis were talking past each other, and that serious, viable Palestinian statehood was not on the agenda. What ended up happening is nothing seemed to be working to advance the Palestinian cause. Diplomacy hadn't worked, armed struggle hadn't worked, peaceful protest hadn't worked, and the Arab-Israeli wars hadn't worked. That's 4 different strategies for resolving the conflict. None of them really worked. So people had no idea how to move forward with it. Meanwhile, other threats emerged in the region. Al-Qaeda emerges and Daesh. Iran emerges as a regional hegemon after the US invasion of Iraq. COVID and climate change are existential threats that competed with the Palestinian issue during the first quarter of this century for Arab countries. Before that, the Palestinian issue was the obvious strategic vulnerability that was always going to explode in everybody's faces. But by 2020, that was no longer the case. And what you ended up with is President Trump issuing a proposal that envisaged Israel annexing 30% of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley, such that any Palestinian entity would be entirely surrounded by Greater Israel. Netanyahu ran on that proposal in the summer of 2020, and he won. And then he was bound to do this annexation. People were demanding he do it. But you've got Trump saying, no, I've given you enough. It's a second term thing. I've got COVID. I really don't want you to do that now. And he didn't really want to do it either. And they didn't know what to do. In swoops the UAE and says, here's the deal. We want to normalize anyway. We'll normalize with Israel if they agree privately to no more annexations for a 5-year period. In other words, the last year of the Trump administration and 4 more years. Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan follow suit. They all did separate deals with Washington. They all had individual reasons. But in every case, the Palestinian issue was left out. It seemed to be fading everywhere.
Okay, we're going to turn our attention now to internal Israeli politics. In the wake of the signing of the Abraham Accords, Benjamin Netanyahu, who had been elected prime minister for the second time in 2009 and had served until the aftermath of the Abraham Accords, is voted out of office for the first time in 16 years, replaced by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, who seek to assemble what they call a government of change. And it was a change insofar as Netanyahu was not the prime minister, but it was very short-lived because a year after it took rise, there was another election in the constantly fluctuating Israeli parliamentary system. Netanyahu emerged in that election, November 2022, as the person with the likeliest path to gain a coalition of 61 in the 120-person Knesset. He did by forging an alliance with the far-right religious Zionist party, which included a faction in it known as Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power, whose leader was the person on the left, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and the person to the right of Netanyahu, Netanyahu's the second person from the left, to the third person from the left, or the person in the middle is Bezalel Smotrich, the leader of the religious Zionist party, 2 hard Zionist activists who had many confrontations with the law because they themselves believed that the government of Israel was not acting vehemently enough in support of the settlers movement. Both of them are avowed racists in their public declarations. Netanyahu, in order to stay in power, forged a coalition with these 2 figures and their party. That guaranteed that the exclusion of the Palestinian question from the agenda, that is to say, the exclusion of any prospect of a negotiated settlement would continue as long as this coalition was in power. The coalition had its own domestic agenda. And one of the most important pieces was what they called a judicial overhaul, what others call a judicial coup, which entailed the recalibration of the balance of power amongst the different branches of government in Israel, an attempt to strip the judiciary of the power that had to this point. Amongst the agenda items of this judicial overhaul were the proposal that a simple Knesset majority could overturn a decision by the Supreme Court, a more politicized process for selecting judges and legal advisors to ministers than had been the case previously. It was a much more neutral professional process overseen by the courts and the Israel Bar Association, and an attempt to override the reasonableness clause, which gave the Supreme Court the authority to overturn appointments or decisions of an administrative nature made by the government that did not meet the bar of reasonableness. All of these initiatives or proposals were attempts to strip the judiciary of its power and place it in the parliament, which in the Israeli system is inextricably linked to the executive because the leader of the governing coalition serves as the prime minister. So there's a real tight link between the two clauses. This set of proposals triggered a massive reaction by the Israeli public, tired of Netanyahu, concerned that these proposals would diminish further the democratic values and institutions of their state. And in January 2023, Israelis began taking to the streets on Saturday nights throughout the country in central squares and towns, villages, and cities. Tens of thousands and then ultimately hundreds of thousands took to the streets in protest against the government, shouting, "Demokratia," democracy. They believed that these proposals represented a frontal assault on the democratic tradition in Israel. Two very significant additional points to make. Amongst those who stood up in protest were tens of thousands of Army Reserves soldiers, people who threatened and, in fact, realized the threat in not showing up for service as long as the government continued with these efforts to overhaul the judiciary. And in fact, perhaps the most important component of the Army reservists who decided to sit out their reserve service were Air Force pilots, considered the most elite of the elite. Many in Israel expressed deep concern that the government initiative would degrade the capacity of the state of Israel to defend itself. This is important to bear in mind as we move towards October 7th. What's important to note as well is that this concern for democracy did not touch upon the Palestinian question in any way, shape, or form. It did not take up the question of the occupation of the West Bank. It was focused almost exclusively on developments within Israel related to this protest.
And that was a deliberate choice on the part of the organizers. They wanted the biggest coalition they could find to deal with this threat, and so they deliberately did not talk about the extraordinary system of repression, the probably most undemocratic system in the entire undemocratic Middle East, which is in the occupied territories. That lurking behind all of that was the concern by many people, not just Palestinians, but also lots of Israelis, that one of the biggest long-term goals of the judicial reform is to free up the government and the Knesset to willy-nilly annex large parts of the West Bank without worrying about the courts. So there is an intimate connection between the two, but it's a little bit subterranean. In the West Bank and Gaza, what's happening at this time? In the West Bank, you have the Fatah-led PA, which should have timed out by 1998 and is still in power, but widely discredited, and the PLO, which represents the Palestinians diplomatically, also considered to be a failure because both of them are tied to this project of negotiating independence with Israel. And that sort of erupted into reality in the early 90s and then ground to a halt a couple of years later, and there had been absolutely no progress whatsoever. Settler violence intensified, especially once Ben-Gvir and Smotrich got control of the West Bank and Israel's administrative authority there, which they have taken away from the army recently, which is very significant and underappreciated. As a result, you've had a rise of armed gangs of young men in the inner cities not connected to Fatah nor connected to Hamas. Some individuals have ties to Islamic Jihad, but not really. They're ad hoc groups of armed young men, the Lion's Den in Nablus and the Jenin Brigade in Jenin. And you've seen the violence over the past 2 weeks in the West Bank by Israel, focused on Jenin and Tulkarm, is precisely to deal with those groups of armed men who are spontaneously organizing to confront the Israeli occupation army and the armed Israeli settlers who are increasingly resembling KKK night riders, honestly, in the way they deal with local Palestinians. They really are looking like that. And behind all of this is the looming threat of annexation and possible mass expulsion, which seems to be where the polity in Israel is going and where the logic of everything Israel is doing towards the Palestinians, especially in the West Bank, is leading to. In Gaza, during the same couple of years, Hamas entered into a series of crises that I'm not going to spend time outlining, but they're severe, that led to them starting to regard, especially the leadership in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar and the late Mohammed Deif and others, to conclude the little emirate they'd built in Gaza was a trap, holding them back rather than a springboard to greater power. Hamas was created in 1987 by the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza during the power vacuum that existed during the first Intifada, with the PLO initially stuck in Tunisia and the uprising largely led by local committees, a kind of Gramscian ad hoc committee uprising. Seeing this vacuum, and they created a political party with a paramilitary attack, Hamas. The point of it is to take over the Palestinian national movement. The point of establishing Hamas, the prime directive of Hamas, unrealized to this day, is to take over the Palestinian national movement and turn it from a secular nationalist project led by Fatah through the PLO and the PA, and turn it into an Islamist one led by them. There are lots of complications. They haven't succeeded at all, but I think you see that really animating their logic, especially in the past year. Plummeting support in Gaza. On the eve of October 7th, we had an excellent poll from Arab Barometer, 6-month poll. High confidence and moderate confidence in Hamas in Gaza, 22%. That's about zero, because that's where the politics of the hijab and the politics of no alcohol and don't smoke and the religious reactionary stuff gets about 20, 22, 25% of people. And then that's it. That's your cutoff. So that's like saying zero support beyond their base. Loss of external support, losing ground with Turkey and with Qatar and others, losing their brand of armed struggle to these armed gangs in the West Bank. These guys are taking the fight to Israel, not them. They're sitting there. And finally, they were very worried about the potential gains for Fatah from a possible US-Saudi-Israeli deal, which there was going to be a significant Palestinian component, mostly money for Fatah, but also some extra powers for the PA. And the first gains and big successes, no matter how limited for Palestinians, since the 90s. And it was going to go to the other guys, who were also going to have a bunch of money for jobs for Uncle Joe, a new school for Jimmy, and better healthcare for grandma. That's bad news for Hamas. They didn't want it, and they moved to stop it.
Just pause for a minute and see where we are as we're about to embark on the next chapter of the story. We recall the Abraham Accords, which were seen as a great gain for Israel and a very substantial loss for the Palestinians, who were largely excluded from the agenda. A second stage of that process was the prospect of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which Palestinians feared would exclude them again. We have the eternal dissension within the Palestinian polity. We have the attention in Israel on the judicial overhaul, the protest against it, and the suspicion that security forces were at a diminished capacity. And I want to be very clear about this. What we've tried to do is help create contextual circles to understand why October 7th occurred. We both believe it is a moral imperative to condemn what occurred on October 7th. Not
a moral and political catastrophe.
What occurred was a breaching of the border in some 30 locations between Gaza and Israel in what's known as the Gaza envelope. That represented the greatest military and intelligence failure in Israeli history, surpassing the previous failure of great scale, which was the 1973 war, when Egypt surprised Israel and made its way into Israel proper. there was an assault, a massive assault by Hamas and Islamic Jihad militants, and then others following them from Gaza that led to the disabling of the communications network that the military and intelligence had set up, the elimination of that network within a matter of minutes, the entry of the militants into military bases, which they succeeded in neutralizing with equal dispatch, and then on to some 30 communities where what occurred was a massacre of unarmed
Brave.
women, children, and men. At the end of that terrible day, led to some 1,200 Israelis killed and 240 taken hostage in Gaza. Estimates are that 100 remain in Gaza, perhaps a little under 100, and it's not known how many of them are alive and dead. This brutal attack by Hamas and its allies produced not just shock, grief, and sorrow, but a profound sense of trauma that led many Israeli Jews to go back to the Holocaust. There was no day that saw the murder of so many Jews since the Holocaust. It's important to note that Holocaust memory plays an extremely important role in Israeli political consciousness and culture. And indeed, the triggering of trauma was profound.
Yeah.
And over the course of time, even at certain points, in that state of shock, on the very day of the massacre, Prime Minister Netanyahu declared that we will take mighty vengeance for this wicked day. I would just say that vengeance is not the ideal condition for rational and effective policy. But in that state of shock, Netanyahu vowed vengeance.
I want to say that the way it was heard, mighty vengeance, on the other side was delende est, Gaza must be destroyed. And I think vengeance is the one thing that has actually been accomplished. You want vengeance? You got vengeance. Everything else, I'm not so sure. But from the Palestinian side, certainly as the Israeli memory of holocausts and massacres from pogroms and things like that was definitely triggered by the events of October 7 and October 8, the Gaza war is regarded by almost everybody among the Palestinians and their friends as another Nakba, as a second Nakba. President Abbas, the head of the PLO and the PA, has said it's a Nakba, and in this sense, pointing the finger at Hamas, a Nakba worse than 1948, when he personally was displaced from his village in southern Israel and never to return. But there certainly was a moment of exultation and pride, not at the massacre, right? It's important to understand what people were reacting to. The fact that armed Palestinians could breach the barrier, that they could break out of Gaza, which was universally regarded as an open-air prison and a cage, that they could break out and take the war to Israel was generally regarded with some degree of pride and enthusiasm, especially at first. That's a poll, an okay poll, not a great one, but not a bad one. 72% of Palestinians in Gaza believed that Hamas' decision was correct. That was in mid-December. I think you might get a different number now from a better poll, but what you have to understand is that it was perceived as an effort to return the Palestinian question to the Arab and international stage, which is how Hamas sold this. I do think that has happened, and I do think it was part of their motivation. I'm not dismissing it. I don't think it was number 1, 2, 3, or 4, but it was certainly there, and it has happened. If you want to understand the psychology of how Palestinians could initially react in a positive way, if not to the killings, but at least to the fighting back part and the fact of piercing the border, pick up and read Fanon, especially on violence, which is the first essay in The Wretched of the Earth. Understand what he's talking about when he describes the cathartic quality in the colonial context, in the minds of the colonized people. He's not advocating this, as some people suggest. That's a misreading of Fanon, and it means you never finished the book. He is accurately describing, as a psychiatrist, the affect. And the affect that we're talking about here was very much there. As Palestinians have been driven from one part of Gaza to another, almost the entirety of the population, 2.2 million people, are themselves refugees already. Right? 95% of them are refugees from what became southern Israel. They are being driven from one part of Gaza to the next and bombed and killed in huge numbers, unknown numbers. The image of these people throwing their belongings on their back and running away from violence is the Nakba. Just as the October 7 is a replay of the Holocaust and pogroms in symbolic terms, this is Nakba 2.0 or 3.0, big time.
Right. As we have said, that clash of collective traumas replays itself over and over again, perhaps no more significantly than the aftermath of October 7th.
Yeah.
I just want to be clear that if I said it is a moral imperative to condemn what occurred on October 7th,
Of course.
we both believe it is a moral imperative to condemn the extraordinary destruction that has been wrought by the Israeli military campaign in Gaza upon Palestinians.
Unbelievable.
Hussein said that we sometimes have disagreements, and I'm going to now raise one of them. Abu Mazen, I think, was from Safed in the north, not the
The north. Safed is in the
just
north.
for the
sorry.
record. The Israeli response following Prime Minister Netanyahu's call for mighty vengeance, Israel declares war the next day, a massive mobilization of reservists, and it's important to note that protest movement that had mobilized so many hundreds of thousands across the country was immediately transformed into a ready supply of soldiers willing to fight what was regarded as a war of existential urgency.
Yeah.
On the 11th of October, Israel began a massive aerial bombardment of Gaza, and about 2 weeks later, the ground invasion of northern Gaza begins. There are haunting echoes today of a similar sequence on another front that we'll get to. During that time, Hamas rocket attacks continue, which serve to justify even further for Israelis the rationale for the war. And yet the question arises, it arose then and it remains with us today. What was the objective of the war? What actually was the goal of the war? It was often articulated at the beginning as the eradication of Hamas. But we now have a good number of leading Israeli military leaders who say either that's impossible to achieve or it is no longer necessary to eliminate Hamas. So there's been a rather staggering lack of clarity about what the precise goals of the war have been.
Do you want to do this?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Unless
No, go.
I'll just say a word. I just want to amplify one point that Hussein made. The scale of devastation, as we said a minute ago, was and is massive, unraveling every facet of life. There's no medical system. There's no daily economic activity. There's no functioning health system. There's extremely limited food. Suggestions are that the average Palestinian in Gaza gets one meal every 2 days. The scale of destruction has been massive. According to an account or counting accepted by most, over 40,000, some 41,000 Gazans have been killed, which includes a huge number of children. As Hussein mentioned, 2 million residents of Gaza have been displaced.
Everybody.
Which is basically the entire population.
2.2 million people.
It's impossible, given that scale, not to conjure up images of the Nakba. And we have seen the pictures from Gaza that call us back to those very pictures of 1948. Right. What's important to note in thinking about that retriggering of trauma is to note the parallelism.
Yeah.
And here again, we are not equating the scale of destruction. We're calling attention to the psychological dimensions of this conflict that ultimately will need to be resolved if there's any hope of escaping the current cycle. 83% of Palestinians believe their victimization is worse than any other people. This is from a poll by the team of Khalil Shikaki, Palestinian pollster, and Dalia Schindlin, Israeli pollster, who also show that 85% of Israelis believe their victimization is worse than others. So you have, once again, these dueling traumas. What is consequential and destructive about trauma as it operates at this collective level is that it very often induces blindness to the suffering of the other. There are very few Israeli Jews who are able to hold on to the scale of destruction that's occurring in some instances 5 miles away. And it's very hard for Palestinians to acknowledge the enormous rending of the human soul that occurred on October 7th. Yeah. That's one of the least salutary features of trauma, which does not have all that many positive features. How did the international community respond? Initially, there was a great deal of sympathy for Israel and a belief that Israel had every right to retaliate and to fortify its security by degrading the threat posed by Hamas. As the campaign continued into the late months of 23 and into 2024, that support began to diminish, with one important exception being the United States of America. Recall that President Biden went to visit Israel shortly after October 7th, declared his unequivocal support for the state of Israel, reiterated his own fervent Zionism, and with some minor exceptions, particularly his decision to restrict the flow of offensive weapons in December 2023, U.S. support has been very solid for the Israeli war efforts. We must also note that while the administration's support has been rock solid on behalf of the Israeli war effort, there are significant political divisions appearing in the United States. Perhaps the most glaring of them is the generational difference. In a survey taken back in January 2024, about 55% of Americans over the age of 65 supported President Biden's policy on Israel, and 70% of individuals under the age of 30 were opposed to it. This is a very significant political factor that may alter the landscape in coming years and decades with respect to the United States' relationship to the Middle East and to Israel. I just want to highlight how limited the awareness or media coverage of what's going on in Gaza, that is to say, to Palestinians, how limited that awareness is in Israel. Israeli media trains almost all of its attention upon October 7th and upon the Israeli war effort and the losses suffered by Israeli soldiers. We have seen emerge over the last 3 months a very interesting divide. That divide is between those who believe that the most important priority for Israel is to continue the war until the end, to eliminate Hamas, versus those who believe that the top priority should be the return of Israeli hostages. What's particularly interesting is that those who tend to support finishing the war off are overwhelmingly religious Jews, both religious Zionists and Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jews. Those who favor the approach of returning the hostages and realizing an age-old Jewish principle known as pidyon shvuim, the redemption of captives, tend to be secular. So it's a kind of surprising realignment.
But the religious don't serve.
And not
so it's great.
Religious Zionists do.
They're good. Send other people off to your war. It's great.
So as we see in those poll figures, there has been a shift in attitudes towards the war and what it can achieve. And that coincides and in fact prompts a new protest movement that has taken rise in the last month and a half or so, which again brings Israelis out to the streets every Saturday night in the hundreds of thousands, this time directed against Benjamin Netanyahu and on behalf of the return of the Israeli hostages.
Good. All right. I think David has made it clear that Netanyahu does not want this war to end. It appears that his logic, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, is the best way to stay out of prison is to stay in power, and the best way to stay in power is to keep the war going, and the best way to keep the war going is to declare the goal of eliminating Hamas, which cannot be accomplished. And also, he is beholden to the people we saw in the screen a few minutes ago, the very pretty individuals with beards that we were looking at, who don't want the war to end at all either. And so he's not likely to agree to anything that will end it. Now, I think that's obvious. What's less clear is why Hamas has been so reticent to want to end the war. And I'll give you an interpretation of what they think they're doing. And I've been right about this since October 12th in the Atlantic. And so I'm really confident. So I'll just say it. Hamas was established, as I told you, to try to take over the Palestinian national movement. And they came to feel trapped and in a quicksand in Gaza. And what they decided to do on October 7th was overturn the apple cart and risk everything that they had built and created, and that anyone in Gaza had built and created during their rule since 2007, and exchange it for what they said they wanted, which is a permanent state of war with Israel. And what could that mean? It could only mean an insurgency against Israeli troops in Gaza, because that is where Hamas operates. It does not operate in the West Bank. It doesn't operate anywhere else, only in Gaza. So they clearly were imagining exactly the scenario that has emerged in recent months as the main Israeli war to so-called destroy Hamas, which is obviously impossible because Hamas is a brand. It's a name. It's not a list of people and equipment that you can kill and destroy. It's a concept. So as long as people say they're Hamas, there's a Hamas. When Israel reached the Rafah, the area of Rafah on the border with Egypt, they had gone through the entire Gaza Strip, destroying everything above ground of perceived value to Hamas. And it could be dual or triple use, all kinds of stuff. Anyway, basically, the whole place is reduced to rubble, literally. And at that point, any concept of the war addressing the entity that was responsible for October 7 is pretty much over. But the war continues in this form. All over the Gaza Strip, in areas that were declared pacified 6 months ago, 9 months ago, Hamas comes up and attacks Israel. Hamas tries to cross the border. Hamas launches a rocket bomb. Hamas here. The Israeli response is invariably a brutal assault, usually leaving 20 to 40 people dead, civilians and what have you. The point is not that. The point is it's become a whack-a-mole counterinsurgency, right? It is a self-perpetuating, there's no stated goal, because it is an end in itself, right? It's a self-perpetuating war. It can never end. That's what counterinsurgencies are like. Unless you're willing to prop up an alternative government, which Israel is not willing to do, unless you're willing to bring the PA back into Gaza, unless you're willing to make them look less ridiculous and less pathetic, then you're stuck with this war endlessly. And I'll point out to you, the Israeli military has recently appointed a senior officer to be the person in charge of all efforts in Gaza. In other words, the military is taking over everything that is done to provide food and medicine, etc. There's a guy in charge. Just like in the West Bank there was until Smotrich and Ben-Gvir took it over for civilian people. But the point is, Israel is hunkering down for the long run in Gaza. It is an insurgency that is open-ended, and that is the war Hamas wanted from the beginning, because it wants to wave the bloody shirt every day and say, we are the Palestinian national leadership, because we and we alone are fighting and dying here for control of Palestinian land in Gaza. And those guys in the West Bank are the gendarmerie of the occupation. And by the way, the PLO is a bunch of clowns and they don't get anywhere. And we are the national leadership. And this is the long-term political strategy. This man, Yahya Sinwar, on the left of the screen there, is thinking in 10, 15 years' time. He's not thinking about the next year. And on October 7th, he wasn't thinking about what would happen in the next year or 2 years or 3 years. He's playing a very long game. And the stakes are control of the Palestinian national movement. David has something to say about the U.S.
In trying to answer this question, why the war hasn't ended, in a certain sense, Netanyahu and Sinwar have a similar interest in perpetuating it. And the question that arises is, why hasn't the U.S. entered more forcefully, exercising its leverage to bring the war to an end? And that, I think, is a function both of Biden's own deep commitments and of longstanding U.S. policy inertia with respect to Israel-Palestine, which seems to both of us to be hopelessly out of date and in need of dramatic revision. I'll just add
also the
that,
balance of power in the U.S. politically.
Yeah, although the United States is a declining power in a unipolar world, it still has the capacity to exercise the leverage, we think, to bring an end to the conflict. And I would say that there is actually a moment at which Biden could do that most logically, and that is after the November election, in that 2-month period before he leaves office. I think we'll wrap up in just a minute, but I want to call our attention to what is the latest threat before us, which is the expansion of conflict from Gaza to the wider region, and particularly Lebanon. As we know, there has been a war of attrition between Israel and Hezbollah. It began anew on October 8th, as Hezbollah understood that it may have a strategic opportunity against Israel in a somewhat weakened state. And that has been followed by increasing Israeli anxiety and willingness to engage Hezbollah and to seek to reorder the balance of power and restore what it sees as its power of deterrence. What we are facing now is the prospect not just of an ongoing aerial campaign, that has led to very significant loss of life and property in Lebanon, but a ground invasion, which echoes the beginning of the Gaza war. At the same time, there's an extraordinary intensification of violence, largely from settlers in the West Bank. And then Lebanon and Hezbollah require us immediately to call attention to Iran, which is the chief patron of Hezbollah, and the prospect of yet another front being opened, and the prospect of Israel settling the score with Iran lurks on the horizon. I want to just conclude the discussion of this slide, at least for me, by saying you might say that each of these fronts, Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Iran, offers up a rational explanation for why Israel might want to act. But when you aggregate them as a whole, it's hard to situate comfortably a rational actor model on that picture. It's hard for me to resist the claim that led by Netanyahu alone, but led by Netanyahu, this is the action of a rogue state, which is very discomfiting in an extraordinarily volatile region.
Oh, I think that's an incredibly useful point. We have another, though, instance of disagreement, a second one. I don't think Hamas saw October 7 as Hezbollah, in Lebanon. I don't think they saw it as an opportunity at all. I think they felt trapped and cornered because Hamas was demanding, rise and shine, it's time to join us. You promised in Beirut and apparently Hamas talked vaguely in this war room Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas had in Dahiyeh in Beirut that, there might be a military conflict with Israel. And they said, oh yeah, great, we're right there with you. And Hezbollah was thinking this is just some vague thing and that is all nonsense. And Hamas was apparently thinking about something very real. So when it happened, Hezbollah said, no. The reaction of Nasrallah, first the leader of Hezbollah was going to hiding for 2 weeks, which is amazing. Nobody loves the sound of his own voice more than this guy, except Chavez, but Chavez is dead. So this guy loves to Babylon, and he just disappeared for 2 weeks. He went to figure out what to say. When he finally emerged, he said, we will join the battle, yes, but we will do it in southern Lebanon in an ongoing effort to liberate Shabbat, these two little villages in the south that Israel keeps hold of, and to defend the border or whatever. And so what they did is they thought they could to save face. They were not seeking a new front with the Israelis, but they felt trapped by their role in the axis of resistance. They needed to do something, but they didn't want a war with Israel at all. I can assure you, Hezbollah and Iran are not interested in going to war with Israel over a place, Gaza, that neither of them cares about, that does not have any strategic, historical, religious, or cultural significance to Hezbollah or to Iran, and an entity, Hamas, which they regard as an unreliable ally, because it is an unreliable ally. Hamas broke with the whole mess of them entirely between 2012 and 2019 over the war in Syria. When the sectarian stuff hits the fan, Hamas is not a part of the axis of resistance. The axis of resistance is a marketing gimmick to explain how a Sunni Muslim Brotherhood party can be allegedly in a neat fit in the Shiite Khomeini alliance that Iran leads. It doesn't really make sense. It's a marriage of convenience. So they're not going to go to war over these guys. Israel is now contemplating the creation of a buffer zone in southern Lebanon, as well as delivering a series of blows to Hezbollah. If you want to ask me about the deeper strategy, I'm happy to talk about it. All I want to say is, yes, Israel is looking at a situation where, over the course of the next few months, they could end up with an open-ended occupation and insurgency in Gaza. It's already there. And the creation of a buffer zone in southern Lebanon, which would create an open-ended occupation and counterinsurgency in Lebanon. And Nasrallah, in his last speech, said, come on, do it. Come into Lebanon. We would welcome that. We like that idea. It's not bluster. He means it. It would be a great opportunity for Hezbollah to go back to what they do best, which is what they did between 1982, when they were founded to fight the Israelis in southern Lebanon, and May of 2000, when Israel withdrew almost entirely, and go back to what also looks to a lot of Lebanese who don't like Hezbollah and don't trust Hezbollah or Iran like a legit war and a perfectly good cause and a reasonable thing to be doing. Their popularity, which has been absolutely terrible over the past year, suddenly went up when the pagers started blowing up all over Lebanon, 4,000 bombs randomly all over the place, and it's getting more and more And if they fight an Israeli occupation in the south, they'll be wildly popular. All Christians will come with crosses made of gold to melt down to make bullets for Hezbollah. One last thing. You see the thing brewing in the West Bank, the same kind of thing, where Israel's use of brute force in Tulkarm and Jenin and the use of settlers and settler night riders is creating the same kind of thing brewing in the West Bank. So you could easily find Israel with open-ended insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, and occupations to the north, to the east, to the west, and then you've got the Mediterranean to the south. If this is security, I'd like to know what insecurity looks like.
So we're going to leave you on that note, though we both have some ideas of what a better day might look like. But I think it's important to say that we don't feel ourselves at the height of optimism at this particular moment. We're happy to talk about that. But in light of the president's commitment to the question, what do we owe one another? We want to leave you with this, some principles of dialogue that we have cultivated and sought to practice ourselves over the last 10 years or so. So do your best to be as informed as you are, but modest enough that you know you don't know everything. Hussein is very committed to the idea that we should be skeptical at every turn and wary of confirmation bias. And finally, we believe it's really important to recognize the stakes for many people engaged in the conversation here in the United States, of course, as well as over there in Israel, Palestine. The stakes are very high. And so when talking with someone, it is important to bring as much curiosity and genuine interest in hearing what they have to say, as well as empathy and active listening. We've taken enough of your time and we look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Bravo, David.
I think we all need to let all of that sink in for just a second. That was an amazing amount of information, 76 years.
Did well.
So we're definitely interested in any questions that all of you have. That was a lot to absorb, in particular our students, but certainly anyone here in the community. We welcome your questions. No question is wrong. No question is, and we already have a few. Terrific. So what we're going to do, since these stairs are so steep and we don't want anybody to fall going up or down, my friend Ben here is going to bring the microphone around. We'll take 3 questions at a time and go from there. So it looks like we've got 3 hands right in this middle section. We'll start here and then move in an organized way so Ben isn't running back and forth too much. Please.
Can you hear me? Thank you so much for your talk. So I noticed that there was a slide on the international response, but what hasn't been brought up is that the International Court of Justice classified what's happening in Gaza as a plausible genocide. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that further, especially since it looks like you were going to talk about that very briefly on a slide, but I guess we must have skipped over that. Thank you.
Yeah, you can't say everything.
If everyone could just help Ben and pass the microphone along. Thanks so much.
My question is in regards to the very far from modest talk about Hezbollah, because the man who was said to Babylon is turning Tel Aviv into ashes as of today. And my question is, do you think is bombed Tel Aviv today, right, in the afternoon? And with
a missile,
yes, with Qadr 1 missiles. So my question is, do we think that will prompt Israel into a military invasion of Lebanon? And what do you think will happen then?
Question.
My name's Francesca, and I am Jewish. And I think the question of genocide is absolutely central to this conversation. And the idea that has not been mentioned is absolutely absurd. As a Jewish person, I think that the tragedy that is happening in Gaza is a genocide, as was the Holocaust. So can you explain why you don't think it is central to call what is happening in Gaza a genocide?
We didn't say it wasn't. Okay. Do we want one more question or do we want to take 3?
We can do maybe one more in
It's
that
up to
same
you.
row. Since the microphone's right there,
Okay,
let's
good.
take one more there.
Yeah, one more.
Hi. So I was wondering, so you mentioned about the Oslo record and the Oslo negotiations, and then you mentioned about when the UAE normalized ties with Israel. In return, there'll be 5 years of no annexation. The illegal settlement has been going on. The Oslo
annexation.
records has basically been hurt the Palestinians more than ever. In 2023, before October 7th, I think about 230 Palestinians got killed in the West Bank, 40 children roughly. 2022, 250, roughly 40, 50 children. So I'm saying, like, what's really the point of when the Palestinians actually tried to put the weapon on the side and the Israelis, not that they ever did, but let's assume they put the weapon on the side and they try to solve this in a peaceful way, quote unquote, and it actually worked out for the Palestinians.
Okay, I understand the question. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to take any of these, or should I go ahead with
You
mine?
start, and I'll take up whatever you want.
Okay, on the question of genocide, we can have that debate. It's no problem. We're not in the business of debating taxonomy. We also didn't discuss the other controversial word, apartheid. We didn't discuss a lot of things that are debated because we're less in the business of sort of disentangling controversies. And the problem with genocide is twofold. The definition under international law begins with intent. And it's hard to establish intent, right? Although I would certainly say this is genocidal, and that's the word I would use. And then the other thing is it describes an intent to destroy in whole or in part a group of people. And that in part also is something that you have to debate. So really the question of genocide could be mentioned, but you'd have to have a whole program on it and get into other genocides. And I would say, honestly, if you want to have a discussion about genocide, you need 2 hours just for that, because it is legitimately contested. You've decided, possible, yes, but it has all, but you have to understand, here's where you get into trouble, because the pro-Israeli side will say, aha, and in fact, they do say this. They say, aha, it didn't say it is a genocide, it said it could turn into one, and here are the steps Israel needs to take to prevent it from becoming one. And then there's the ongoing case that may eventually turn out. So there's a way of reading this as saying, this is general, which is certainly what I would say, especially when it comes to the use of food as a weapon of war. On the other hand, the Israeli side can say they had a chance to call it a genocide and they didn't. They said it could become one. So it's very vexed. And I think we wanted to talk about the whole problem in a broader term without getting bogged down in words. You go ahead.
Let me jump.
Yeah, then there are
look,
three more
Francesca,
questions.
I totally understand the passion, importance of your question.
And I share it.
For reasons of time, skipped over the ICJ determination of plausible genocide. What I would say is this. There's been massive destruction wrought and very severe violations of international humanitarian law have been committed. War crimes have been committed in my mind. The doctrine of proportionality has been shredded into meaninglessness. And I accept the ICJ's provisional determination. As Hussein mentioned, intent is an extremely high bar to pass in international law, very rare. I actually have an open mind. I don't know what the evidence is that sort of makes absolutely clear that intent has been proven.
16,000 Palestinian children.
That's inferring intent from deed, which works for me, but it's not necessarily going to work for the ICJ in the long run. I just said that's the same thing. I agree with you. So I'm convinced, but the ICJ is not yet convinced. They haven't made a ruling on it.
Yeah, and
I mean, it's my opinion. It shares your opinion, but that doesn't do much.
I would just affirm that I accept what the ICJ has said, and I await its determination. But in the meantime, I would say, let us not waste time debating the term. Let us really call attention to what is provable. And I think it is very clear to me that very severe violations of international humanitarian law have been committed, crimes of war, and possibly genocide.
There's no way I think you could fairly look at what we said today and think that we underplayed what has been done in Gaza by Israel. We have not. We have given it full due deference. If you're looking for a specific word you didn't hear, that's a specific word. But I think we've been eminently fair in how atrocious this savage war of vengeance has been. And if you don't think so, then I think you're being unfair. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, good idea. That's as if we disagreed with it, which we don't. Having made the point that everyone agrees with, I'd like to get on to the other questions. The missile attack in Israel, yes, it's a very good question you asked. I do believe the Israelis are preparing to invade southern Lebanon to create a buffer zone there that they will call a security zone. It will be an illusion of security. It will change nothing. It will not bring an ounce more security to northern Israel. It will, in fact, justify Hezbollah in everything they do. It will create a wave of sympathy, not just in Lebanon, but throughout the Arab world, and support for Hezbollah. And, sorry? It depends on when. Everything that they've ever done is not justifiable. Some things are justified and some things are not justified. When Hezbollah turned its guns internally in Lebanon in 2008, that was definitely not justifiable. On the other hand, when Hezbollah fought the Israelis in southern Lebanon between 82 and 2000, that was very justifiable. In other words, if they go back to fighting Israel in Lebanese soil, almost everyone in Lebanon will say, bravo alaik, yalla, go. And their political fortunes will go up. They'll be back to doing what they like. And I take Nasrallah seriously when he said, come on, ahla wa sahlan fik, we would love it. I think he really means it. And I think just as Israel has given Yahya Sinwar the war he wants now, not the last year, but now he's getting the war he wanted, the insurgency, which can go on forever. I think Hassan Nasrallah says welcome and he's going to get the war. I think Netanyahu is on a rampage. And anyone in Israel who thinks this is the way to get security needs their head examined. But people are traumatized, people are tribal, people are angry. What can you do? As for laying down of guns and peace with Israel, both sides have failed to really, I think, meet the moment at any time when they could have. However, I do think the bottom line is the Palestinians, through the PLO, recognized Israel in 1993, and Israel has never recognized the Palestinian right to a state. And that asymmetry lies at the heart of your question about Palestinian openness to peace. And I think it's a real problem because the asymmetry in recognition is a reflective of the asymmetry of power. And that's one of the main reasons we don't have an agreement. Quickly.
I know that negotiations are okay with Israel.
Yeah.
So why would the Palestinians not?
Oh, yeah, I understand. Yeah, I understand that. The argument, okay, it's good. Your question is good. So the argument would be that, and again, you can have, this would be an internal Palestinian argument that they do have every day, and that the country would have to come to a determination. When is it wise? Because people say you have the right to resist occupation by armed means. Yes, of course you don't have to take hostages and shoot people in their homes, but you do have the right to fight the Israeli army. The question then becomes, when is it efficacious? When does it make sense? When does it cause more harm than good, etc.? And that is a very complicated strategic question for the Palestinian people themselves, not for two guys on the stage.
I'll just jump in and say,
but you make a good point.
It is a very good point.
It's
a very good point because the other means that have been proposed, which include the path of negotiation, has not yielded liberation for Palestinians. And even a nonviolent movement like BDS has been essentially criminalized. And the question is, what means remain? What is legitimate then in pursuing the struggle for freedom and liberation? I think that's a very serious question. I think it's a question we need to think, all of us here need to think very seriously, especially Americans. If America is not going to play the role in exercising leverage in moving towards a much more just resolution, I believe we need to really think creatively about what is a legitimate form of expression of opposition to subjugation for Palestinians. It's a very serious question. I'd like to think, as an advocate of nonviolence, it's not armed struggle. But I understand the logic. What if we don't add nonviolent options to the toolkit, then Palestinians will say we have no recourse. And I think that places the onus on the other actors, not on Palestinians to make that decision, but on the other actors, let us say the Israelis and the United States principally, to come up with legitimate alternatives. Because if not, this is where we're going to end up.
Yeah, I think David is exactly right. If you foreclose all the nonviolent options, you leave only, and that's your point, and you're making a good point. The only thing I would say is that right now, I just want to recall that in my talk before the Abraham Accords, I pointed out that nonviolent resistance at Samud had not worked, diplomacy had not worked, armed struggle of Palestinians had not worked, and Arab-Israeli wars had not worked. So one of the reasons the UAE took the step it took is that it just concluded there wasn't anything that was going to work. The Palestinians, though, cannot take that decision because they are who they are, and they live it. So, yeah, David's right. If you don't give people
just
an option,
one more point. I guess I'd ask, how has it worked out?
Yeah, not well.
Not well. And for that matter, armed military action has worked out very badly for Israel as well.
Yeah.
The
whole thing is a mess.
Hamas has not been defeated. The hostages have not been returned.
Yeah.
The reputation of Israel in the world has never been lower. Israeli soldiers are being killed every day.
Economy
and
is
massive
damaged. Yeah.
destruction has been wrought on Palestinians' Gaza.
Yeah.
So where's the win from their perspective?
Okay, let's
No,
move on to
this
some other
can't be a
people. Sorry,
debate, though.
just want to get in more questions. Thank you so much.
So we got 2 women in the back there, all the way at the top. Yeah. And then in the front. Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, 4 is good. Yeah, we'll
Thanks
write them
again
down.
Right here,
for
right
the
here.
talk, and thanks again
Questions
for
right here.
allowing our questions as well.
Yeah.
Which the questions have got me thinking. From the very first one, the very polite question there about discussing the ICJ ruling and not debating the term, but more so a beautiful critique about your presentation. I'd just like to suggest another critique about your presentation that it wasn't brought up about the so the slides were in order with the history of the Nakba and then October 7th, and you definitely made a beautiful condemnation of October 7th, but the wording of condemning the history that led up to October 7th was like after, so it was like very confusing. I'm sure very emotional for
that's
some
fine.
audience members of the order.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah,
Could you
just
keep
Jay,
I made
I
a
think,
note.
I think,
Sorry.
just
We're
to
gonna
say,
do
I think, if I recall, I made clear that one must assume the same stance of moral condemnation of what Israel has done in Gaza,
Yeah, you do.
which I think is absolutely essential.
But she was talking about,
the Nakba.
48 and
Right.
that stuff, and
Okay,
we did
well,
just
I'll
talk
say a
about
word
it.
about that.
We talked
So-
about it dispassionately. It's true.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
I have 2 quick questions. First one is, what do you think the role of the Arab states, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, what do you think their role as mediators are in this conflict? And second one is Ismail Haniyeh. He was assassinated seemingly by the Mossad
Yes.
in Iran. And what do you think the intentions and implications of that are?
Good. Excellent questions.
Thank you both for being here and speaking on this difficult issue.
You're
I'd like
welcome.
to hear your expertise on a recent development that was seen in the news, and that was on August 19th when Hamas and ISIS collaborated on and conducted a suicide bombing in Tel Aviv, which they claimed a joint responsibility for. My question then is, what do you think the objective is for these extra actors in the conflict, such as ISIS, Hezbollah, Iran? What do you think their objective is? Is it to obtain a ceasefire, to alleviate the suffering of Palestinians? Is it to eliminate or destabilize the Israeli state? Could you just speak on what the objective of these external actors are?
Okay. You will have 4.
Hi, thank you guys so much for coming out. My name is Jamil. I'm a Palestinian American here
Great.
at Notre Dame. So my question is less political science focused, but more peace studies focused. So in what ways do you think generational trauma influences political action within both the Palestinian and Israeli communities, especially in the context of resistance and demands for justice? And how might this trauma shape future peace negotiations between both sides in the future?
Oh, what a great question.
Hi, my name is Fadwa. You mentioned that genocide requires intent and attempt to destroy in whole or in part a people.
Yeah, that's the definition.
So Israel is a Jewish ethno-state, meaning it does require a majority Jewish population.
Mm-hmm.
David Ben-Gurion, the founder, did state in his quotes that he wanted to have a majority Jewish population and that he did want to eradicate the Palestinian population. People from the current government have made similar sayings.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also some policies embedded in Israel as a government, such as the refusal of right to return of Palestinians, whereas Jewish people from the diaspora are free to go to Israel even if they were not born there.
Okay.
Do you believe this implies an intent and attempt
Good.
to destroy a people in part or in whole?
Super interesting question. Thank you. Oh, 1/5. Okay, fine. We're writing.
Hi, I'm Baram Shakeenush. I'm not a student. My apologies.
Hi.
I'm a fellow here at Notre Dame. Hi, Hossein. It's good to see you. Thank you very
Good to see
much
you.
for this very comprehensive presentation. And it's bold to present it at this moment of time. I have to say that I came to the United States some 26 years ago as an international student from Iran. And we had a similar presentation about Palestine, but the content was obviously somewhat different. It was very there was an apologist undertone, and you can't but help empathize with the speakers. We have been re-narrating the history of Palestine, and I wonder if it might make sense to help us understand some of the structural factors that cause this conflict, beyond the heart-wrenching issues of genocide and death and starvation and bombardment and killing, etc. What are the structural factors that keep repeating themselves and have evaded us for at least the last 26 years that I still remain a student of Palestine and Israel? Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Do we want to start answering or do we want more questions? I don't mind.
Okay,
You're
sure.
the boss, dude.
Who starts?
Everybody wants to talk, so we can just let people talk, and then that will be enough.
Go down here, the woman in the pink.
Oh, my question was going back to Lebanon. There's been a lot of back and forth between Hezbollah and Israel over the years, but a lot of it has been theatrical and doesn't really lead past that. So I was wondering how sure your predictions are of an all-out war that expands past the South and what the regional responses might be and whether a regional war is on the horizon.
Great question. I love that one. I'm definitely answering that one. Time is not going to let.
I have two-part question. This is going to sound like a conspiracy theory, but has there been any theorization about the fact that all the leadership in the Middle East are somehow conspiring with each other to perpetuate their leadership? Because it seems like they throw the ball at each other, and between Netanyahu, between Hamas, has this seriously been something that has been investigated or at least theorized about? Because it just feels that they are playing it within each other's realm. My second question, has also there been any noticing or notification of how Israel prior to 1948 came to exist through violence, through militia attacks, and through that, and how whether was it the PLO in the 70s or Hamas later on taking on the same mantle and doing the exact same thing?
In our normal 4-part one, we get into that in great detail. But in this case, we just tried to get to the present day as quickly as possible so that it would be containable time-wise. But yeah, that's all super important. And we normally talk about it a lot. Should we begin?
Why don't you field some of those? We have 15 more minutes together. So you want to take a couple of those and then we'll do one more survey. We'll give you guys 5 minutes to respond to what you can.
All right, we do now?
Sure. Okay, I'll start, and I want to begin with the questioner who was sitting here and asking about condemnation of the Nakba and its absence from representation.
Ask a question and leave, but okay.
Maybe she didn't leave.
I want to know the answer.
Okay. So what I would say is
it's weird
that in my own sense of things, the requisite historical act of rectification that is most important is to address the dispossession of Palestinians. That is to say, if we understand a pendulous move in history, Jews received, fought for, were aided by the international community, were granted, fought for sovereignty, created a state, and I'll go back and talk about that in response to another question. And just in terms of historical sequencing, it seems to me that the necessary next step for any meaningful measure of historical justice to be realized is for Palestinian displacement and dispossession to be recognized, acknowledged, and responsibility taken. So I want to be very clear about that. I think any meaningful prospect for a resolution of hostilities between Israelis and Palestinians will not be achieved until that occurs. And that relates also to the question about generational trauma. What we have to acknowledge is that in addition to the structural factors that we hopefully will talk about, there are very important collective psychological factors that are vividly present in this conflict. When I assess the array of forces and think of what is the necessary next step of historical rectification, I'm very attuned to the fact that the trauma of Palestinians will really never be adequately addressed unless there is widespread international recognition of the huge injustice that was done to them. That must come, as I said, with acknowledgement and with the appropriate steps of reparative justice, which are ultimately going to have to be decided through some process of negotiation.
Yeah.
I think, I just want to emphasize that I think that is really where the next pendulous swing of history must move in that direction. So I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. That's both in moral terms and in practical political terms. Do you want to jump in on that, or should I?
No,
What are the questions about the other?
I want to talk about that for a second, but you go ahead.
Yeah,
you
I also want to, again, the question about genocide and Ben Gurion and the creation of the State of Israel, does it itself, its existence represent, and that is, its very existence represent a genocide? This is where I think we come to the question of competing rights. Do Jews, after the most comprehensive attempt at mass extermination, deserve a place under the sun? In my view, Absolutely, yes. Is there a reason to believe that Jews have a deep and meaningful and legitimate connection to that land? I believe yes. Was Zionism alternately blind to and committed to diminishing a Palestinian presence in order to achieve the goal of sovereignty? I say blind, I say willfully blind in some instances, and at other points in time, committed to the proposition of depopulating the land of non-Jews. And that's where I would say, I think, settler colonialism gets it right. What I think is missing, and this is not the ultimate justification of what transpired, what I think is missing is an awareness that Zionism was not just a project committed to elimination, but also to salvation of a people in a very desperate position. And that's where we get to the irreconcilability of rights. And I'm not sure how to undo it at this point. The question that I vex over often, given where we've come, which is, I believe, to a point of really a supremacist regime, a regime committed to the region from the river to the sea being exclusively Jewish. The question I pose to myself over and over again is, was this an inevitable and inescapable result of the creation of a monoethnic Jewish state? And along with that, I ask, if not, what course correction could have been taken and when? And this exists in the realm of the counterfactual. So I would just go back to say that I believe the Nakba is that historical act that must be attended to, that must be recognized, responsibility for which must be taken by Israel, and for that matter, other actors. And at the same time, I do ponder whether that project that sought to describe itself as Jewish and democratic can ever succeed in striking that balance.
No.
And if not, then we have to be mindful of the fact, as the political theorist Mahmoud Mandani reminds us, that the ultimate act of justice would not be to either displace or subjugate Jews, simply, in a certain sense, upend the hierarchy, but really to create a political framework in which there were equality for all. And that can take many different forms. Right? It can take the form, you can, 1, 2, in between. That's the great challenge, and both of us feel in a state of despair for reasons that Hussein may elaborate on as he talks about the regional consequences.
I don't think no. I'm going to answer the same question differently.
These are the questions with which we have to grapple.
So I want to answer that question because, again, there's difference, right? Sometimes there's agreement, sometimes there's difference. I understand exactly what you're talking about when you go back to the founding of the Israeli state. Then the fact that ethnic cleansing was a prerequisite for the establishment of an Israeli state, that on the eve of the creation of Israel, it was not possible for the UN to carve out, even through the weirdest gerrymandering in the partition resolution of 1947, a significant area of Palestine that had a Jewish majority. It was not there. So that even the proposed Jewish state in the partition plan of 1947 had an Arab plurality in it. You just couldn't create that area. So ethnic cleansing was effectively a prerequisite for the establishment of a Jewish majority state of Israel under those circumstances in 1948. And everything we've seen continues the logic of that, which is articulated in the Balfour Declaration, which gets put in the mandate, that a homeland for the Jewish people, therefore Jews are a national group who deserve a homeland, and a national home for the Jewish people. Civil and religious rights for everybody else, who at the time were like 97% of the population. But means that the Palestinians get individual rights, religious rights, civic rights, rights that every individual has, but not collective rights, not national rights, not a national aspiration. I think the logic of Balfour was extended into the mandate. It was then instantiated in 1948. And we are seeing the ultimate kind of logical conclusion of that with what I fully expect to be, and have been predicting for 10, 15 years now more, most of the West Bank and the expulsion of the Palestinians from there, possibly Gaza as well. I don't know. I don't think that important to the Israeli plan. But the question then becomes, does this politicide this effort to eliminate the Palestinians as a viable political national project between the river and the sea in their historic homeland of the Palestinians, to eliminate their national movement in their place of origin. Like you could export it to Jordan. Great. From an Israeli point of view, they keep saying Jordan is Palestine. Since the 60s, they've been saying it. Is that just? And I don't know the answer under international law because of those, because I'm not an international lawyer. It deserves a word that describes a crime that is very severe. Whether the right word is genocide or politicide, I don't know. But I have described it in much more accurate terms, much more detailed and historical terms than just throwing out the word genocide would have done. And this is my point about relying on buzzwords. That long paragraph I just gave you about beginning with Balfour and coming all the way up to what's going to happen in the West Bank, in my view, in the next 10 years, was a lot more meaningful about Palestinian human and national rights and their denial of those things than getting up and saying genocide and walking out. I believe I did more with my answer than I would have done if I had used words that people are looking for me to use and not hearing. So that's my point on that one. On some of the other questions, the point of the Haniya hit was to ensure that the hostage deal that Netanyahu does not want would not go through, because whacking the main negotiator on the other side is a great way of blocking a deal, right? Excellent. And also to humiliate Iran, because the degree of penetration that Israeli intelligence has demonstrated over Iran, killing this guy in a safe house with a bomb that was put there 2 months ahead of time, and then they knew exactly when he was there with his personal bodyguard, but no Iranians inside, just to keep the lid on the thing. Total penetration. Ditto with the pager and walkie-talkie attacks in Lebanon. Total penetration. Humiliation is a big part of this. And the Haniya hit, I mean, I understand the pager thing is also a psychological warfare. It's practically designed to put people in hospital and get them off the battlefield, all kinds of things. But I think humiliation and demonstrating a kind of intelligence penetration superiority has been part of the game related to Lebanon, related to Israel, Hezbollah, and Iran. And Israel has established escalation dominance in Lebanon with regard to Iran and Hezbollah because they haven't cared. It's a minority in Israel that actively wanted a war before now. But even the people who were skittish in the government were ambivalent, whereas they knew very well that Hezbollah and Iran didn't want to have a war for the reasons I said. There's nothing in it for them, as I explained. So that gave Israel escalation dominance. They could keep turning up the heat as much as they wanted because they didn't mind if they ended up in a war. And guess what? They, I think, are about to get into one that they will rue the day, in my view. Structural factors, you're absolutely right. Again, if we had the full thing, you'd hear more about it. It is really a big deal, and I totally agree with you. But we just put things into perspective. Last thing, conspiring leaders. I think two things. Number one, everybody in power in the Middle East is guilty until proven liking the current status quo. You got to do some heavy lifting to show me you don't secretly like it because it keeps you in power. So I'm with you on that. You can see how especially Netanyahu and Hamas have been in a really deep, unstated partnership, each with different goals, but wanting the same set of facts to perpetuate themselves. They've been in a deep partnership since the late 80s, and Netanyahu was the first to say, those of us who don't want a Palestinian state to be formed need to support Hamas and get funding, not Israeli money, but Qatari money and Turkish money and Iranian money, into Gaza to keep them viable and the non-viable, but barely surviving, and divide and rule, and then we don't have to worry about a Palestinian state. In terms of crushing Palestinian aspirations for independence and citizenship, it's worked really well. In terms of creating that made October 7 inevitable, and I don't say likely, I say inevitable, also perfect. In a certain sense, Netanyahu must have known that he was creating this kind of situation. Those of us, people like me, who've spent the past 10 or 15 years in print in the Atlantic and elsewhere warning that was going to be, not could be, not maybe, not probably, but definitely, inevitably, going to be an explosion of horrendous violence coming out of the occupied Palestinian territories Couldn't say by whom or what or where or when, but definitely that it would happen. 100% sure, unless there was a dynamic that offered them some hope and some pathway. We were talking about armed struggle and diplomacy, right? Give them some kind of pathway other than armed struggle. And that certainly didn't happen. We were not kidding. Those of us who were saying this were not kidding. We were not guessing. We were not making it up. We knew we were right. And I wish I had been wrong, because I don't think the past year has been good for the Palestinian national movement or for Israel or for anybody. This has been a catastrophe upon a fiasco upon a debacle, in my view. But I just finish my sentence is to say that I was not making it up. I knew this was going to happen. And I am not smarter than Netanyahu. I am not in possession of more information than Netanyahu. I am not more experienced than Netanyahu. So if I knew, I'm telling you, I just didn't care.